This is Jason Van Tatenhove here, and I am working on a story on the um, designation of the national monuments that happened both in Nevada and Utah over the New Year weekend by the Obama administration. On the line, I have with me Warren Markowitz, who's an attorney, a friend of Michelle Fiore, who connected me up with him, and he's got some interesting takes on this situation. Hi, Warren. Thanks for joining us. Can you please introduce yourself and give our readers and listeners a bit of a background as to yourself?
Sure. Thank you very much for spending the time with me, Jason. Um, it, Background's rather interesting. I'm a former Wall Streeter that became a lawyer, which is unusual because most lawyers who don't know how to find a job usually wind up on Wall Street. I got tired of being pushed around by the federal regulators and the state regulators and all the people who said they knew how the business was supposed to run and decided to tell us what to do and kind of turn the tables on them. I've been working in the litigation environment. In other words, I do a lot of problem solving, bank litigation, bank regulation, government, federal oversight, things like that. So I've got my hands in a lot of pieces of the puzzle when it comes to both states' rights issues and business rights issues and all the fun stuff where the government says, well, we know better than you do on how to do things. Uh, I'm originally from New York, born and raised on Long Island, educated in New York. I came out to Las Vegas, where I live now, where I met Michelle Fiore about 10, almost 12 years ago. And I've been involved in, I'll call it third-party politics. At present, I am the county chairman for the Independent American Party, which is the Constitution Party affiliate here in Nevada. And we are the third largest party in Nevada. Through that, and through my just being a social butterfly, so to speak, I've met a lot of people in the political environment, both on Republican side, Democrat side, independent side, and so forth. And I managed somehow, through my curiosity of current events and what was going on, got myself involved in the Bundy matter, which has now become the Bundy trial matter, which is now also the Bundy Gold Butte matter, which all surrounds the issue of land use, land rights, land control, ownership, and so forth. And what I've done with that is several people have done some poking around and brought some ideas to me and said, you know what, there may be some legitimate claims regarding who owns the land, who controls the land, how the land is supposed to be used from a historical perspective. And so what I did with the aid of some friends of mine is we dug a little bit and poked around and actually discovered some substantial issues that we've brought to the attention of the legal team that is currently representing Mr. Bundy and some of the defendants in the 2014, and I'll use the air quotes issue of standoff, and which has now been brought to light again based upon the current actions of our president, Barack Obama, who decided to turn the Gold Butte area into a 300,000 acre national monument. And what we've done there is we've looked back at some of the historical documents, and everybody knows what Nevada, well, I shouldn't say everybody knows, but most people know what Nevada looks like, where that state jam between Arizona and Utah and California, where the guy that sits there with the triangle and the big old point at the bottom. What most people don't know, even though they recognize the fact that we became a state just before the end of the Civil War in 1864, is that we didn't look like that then. We added territory to Nevada in steps up to almost about 1870, 1867, 68, in which the territory of Nevada, which became the state of Nevada, didn't have that big old point at the bottom. she had was pretty much squared off. That big old point at the bottom belonged to the territory of Arizona.
Now, to clarify, that point is where the Golden Butte area and the Bundy Ranch is located.
That's correct. Clark County, which was the federal government owned that piece of Arizona territory. Now, no one's going to argue with the simple fact that the federal government can control territory it either takes from in war or captures or acquires that isn't a state or doesn't belong to a state. It's simple sovereign rights. It's a simple concept that has existed from time immemorial. The sovereign controls the territory it captures during war. Well, the 1848 Treaty of Hidalgo gave us a lot of the Southwest, and as part of that treaty, we carved up the territories into Utah, Nevada, Arizona, and so forth. And when Nevada became a state, she had a pretty much squared off bottom. It was, and almost, for the most part, a rectangle. Okay? Well, as time went on, additional territory was added to the territory of Nevada, and then Nevada became a state. Well, somewhere along the lines of 1866, and pretty much the 1867 issues, which was after statehood, Nevada added what is now Clark County, and a stretch of territory that goes all the way up to pretty much the Idaho border on the east side of the state. Those were after acquired territories. That was after acquired land. And one of the big catches that they use when BLM, and I'm using BLM as the point man for the Department of the Interior, because they're the ones that are tasked with managing and handling public lands or lands that are maintained by the federal government, allegedly on behalf of the people of the state or the people of the country, in what's known as a land trust. And we've heard about the issues of land trust, where if we want to sell open territory, open space that for public use or for private use, we have to give to get. In other words, if we sell 1,000 acres, we have to deposit 1,000 acres back into the trust in one form or another. And that's happened as Las Vegas has grown. You've heard about the shifts that are going on down here. Now, Clark County, Gold Butte, Mesquite, Moapa, Overton, places like the Valley of Fire, those are all part of the territory that was given from Arizona, the territory of Arizona, to the state of Nevada in 1866. Well, there's a little bit of a bump in the road. Typically, when you have a trust, so whether it be a private trust where you take your home and you put it into a trust so that when you die, you can give that asset would be transferred to another set of beneficiaries without having to go through probate. There's two parties. There's the grantor, which is the person or entity that gives the property, and then after the grantor, there's the beneficiary, and then there's a trustee. Now, the beneficiary is the one who's supposed to benefit from the particular asset in the trust, or what's known as the trust corpus. And the trustee is the one who's supposed to manage it. And one has what's known as equitable rights, the other one has what's known as legal rights. Well, when we were formed as a state, we forever gave up, according to our Constitution, according to the enabling acts that was adopted as part of the Constitution, all the unoccupied lands within the state of Nevada. We gave them up to the federal government. Okay. In 1864, we had so many different acres. We weren't using it. We were actually sparsely populated. And to some extent, we didn't even have enough people within the territory to form a state. But that was the deal we struck with the feds. Well, it didn't say anything about after acquired territory. And in general trust law, the concept of a trust means if property comes from a grantor to a grantor, in other words, from one person who owns it and controls it to the same person who owns it and controls it, there's no trust formed. So here we've got the federal government in 1866 going, okay, you know what? we're going to give you this amount of territory here based upon off of the Arizona territory, and we're going to let the state of Nevada have it. Well, that's what they did. An act of Congress came along and said, from this point on, from this point here to this point here, and they laid out the entire thing. They gave that land from Arizona to Nevada.
And when was that exactly?
That was That was a congressional act of 1866.
Okay.
That land was actually given to Nevada. Well, that means it wasn't part of the land we forever gave up because we got it after the fact, what's known as after acquired property. Well, herein lies the problem. The grantor happens to be the federal government. It wasn't placed in that territory or those open spaces that were not occupied because in 1864, when the Constitution was signed and the state was created, it wasn't there. So it couldn't be bound by that, and shouldn't be bound by that because it came out of what would have been the federal government placing it into a trust, but the federal government didn't place it into a trust. They actually gave it to the state of Nevada, where the legislature was supposed to formally adopt it, which, believe it or not, I don't think they did until 1972, which was in effect just a simple way of saying we're going to conform our Constitution to the borders of the state. In other words, the state constitution in 1864 read the borders were X. In reality, the borders were Y. So the big problem that I've learned, or at least I've identified, is that there is a legitimate claim that the state land, or the lands that the federal government under BLM claims as part of their trust, has never belonged to them after 1867 because they gave them away.
They gave them to the state of Nevada, which took over administration of those lands.
Right. And there is no formal agreement that I've found that says the state of Nevada is now allowing BLM to manage the range, manage the lands, manage the properties for the benefit of the people of the state of Nevada. So you can do that. It happens in some other areas. You can do that where you can have state land managed by a federal agency through an agreement. It's a simple contract. It's an agreement, and it's done. And it's been done more than once. Well, this is where the Bundy issue comes into effect. Well, one of many at least, is that Bundy's claim is that he doesn't have a contract with the federal government to manage his land, to manage grazing rights, to do the range improvements, because he in effect fired them, and he didn't believe that the federal government has control over those territories. And territories, I'm talking about the Gold Butte area where he grazes his cattle. Well, that's some legitimacy there because he bases it on the fact that the land belongs. His particular belief was the land belongs to the state of Nevada. Historically, he's got a claim, a legitimate claim, that the land does belong to the state of Nevada. But if you read the documents in which he's being charged, and now I'm not determining whether or not his actions were right or actions were wrong. I'm talking about the actual hard copies you can pull from the court under PACER.
Right.
The document says that the federal government has forever controlled this land since the Treaty of Hidalgo in 1848. Well, that's not exactly 100% true. They acquired it in 1848 under the treaty, but they gave it away. And they gave it away in 1867 to Nevada. So there's a very big land problem right now about who controls it. And in the 1960s or I think in the late 1950s, early 1960s, there was a murder trial. And one of the arguments that the defendant brought up during an appeal was that the courts didn't have jurisdiction over him because the territory was never adopted by Nevada, and therefore the laws that were being applied to him were illegitimate. Well, the courts turned around and said, the state courts turned around to him and said, well, if that was the case, then everything in Clark County would be in limbo, including all the casinos, all the people, all the land ownership, everything, and therefore that the land was adopted, whether not necessarily formally, but informally when Nevada acquired the territory from Arizona. So that helps support the foundation that the land belongs to the state of Nevada. Now you fast forward to 2016, just before the end of the year, and President Obama turns around and says, you know what? I'm going to use the Antiquities Act and take 300,000 acres, which pretty much is jammed between Las Vegas or the Grand Canyon and Lake Mead, and say, you know what? Gold Butte is now a national monument. He did it with over, what was it? What was the article I read from the RJ? It was almost 1.5 million acres with in Utah.
The barriers, yes.
Yeah. Now here's the thing: the Antiquities Act was designed for, and it's actually very simple. If you look it up, the Antiquities Act is about 3 paragraphs long. Its purpose is fairly simple: it's to protect historical areas, it's to protect archaeological areas, it's to protect cultural areas, and it's usually supposed to be done in the smallest piece possible. I mean, the Appomattox Courthouse is one of the places that was done, and it's on an acre. And these are some of the things. Now,
and if you look at a graph of other times the Antiquities Act has been used, this latest round is to a great degree larger than anything else previously.
It's certainly up there in the top 5. I mean, I looked over it just the other day after our first conversation, and recognized that there was a lot of. It's been used predominantly in the early 20th century, and when it was formed, because it was started in 1906. But overall, it was used to protect, and it is supposed to be used to protect places of historical and archaeological significance. And in order to access that land, you now need to get a permit for an archaeological dig, for historical review. It has to be through, they don't say it directly, but you would assume through universities or through properly funded programs, which would in effect take Gold Butte out and make it a useless piece of property that no one can use.
Now, does that include the family trusts that Harry Reid had previously? We had the solar farm that a lot of people were speculating about. Would that stop access to things like that, or is it still open through different channels?
My understanding, even though there was there was an article about that grazing may be allowed on that land, is my understanding of the application of the Antiquities Act is commercial use ceases, mining ceases, oil and gas drilling ceases, any commercial use ceases. It's a historical monument. It's like asking me if I can put an oil rig, next door to the Appomattox Courthouse. Chances are the answer is going to be no, and there's a reason for it, because it impedes the historical value of the particular area. Now there are, There are petroglyphs, and there are historical reference, places within that territory, within the Gold Butte area, in regards to the history of Nevada and the history of the West and so forth. I don't think anybody would argue if those were set up as enclaves within the territory that allowed its proper use and proper management by the state. But here we have a situation in which the federal government comes in and claims 300,000 plus acres in an area that's legitimately under dispute and has been for decades. As an attorney, I see a potential and probable lawsuit. Whether it's taken on by the state is a different story, who is likely to be the first person who should be up in arms. But I could also see the Bundy family being the last ranching family out there, who having their home effectively turned into a national monument, taking the reins and filing a suit against the Department of the Interior and Bureau of Land Management, and actually looking to have the designation overturned. But that's a legal battle that is not only uphill, but it's time consuming, and I'm not to say that it shouldn't be done, but it's an expensive fight to take.
Sure, and right now we know that the situation they've been put in, that may not be something they can undertake. And on the White House press release put out with this executive order, it stated clearly that they were not going to allow any cattle grazing. That the last of the permits were issued, I want to say, in '98, and the Bundys were the last of the original 56 families that were there, that was running any sort of cattle.
Well, that's another thing. Is the permit I think you're referring to was supposed to have been acquired by Clark County and then retired. So you have two prongs of the fight. If you remember, one of the arguments or one of the statements that Cliven Bundy made was that he tried to pay the county for his grazing fees, and then they rejected it. Well, they rejected it because they said they couldn't take it. But in effect, if they had the permit and he was paying them, he intended to pay them for it, there's a complicated legal issue there in which they were the rightful owners and users of the permit if Clark County actually did acquire it. The other side of the coin is we still haven't determined whether or not Clark County even had to acquire the permit. It goes back again to the land management issues. It goes back to the territorial controls. It goes back to whether or not that land was given to the federal government under the Constitution, whether it was acquired thereafter, which we have no evidence of it ever being, and so forth. So there are complicated matters in this, and it's not just a straight line and it's more of a very curvy path to try and figure out the answers to this question. The matters we find in front of us is whether or not this issue, this designation of a national monument, is going to allow. Well, it's unlikely that it's going to allow any commercial use, which would include grazing. But even if it did include grazing, whether or not they'll be able to issue a permit for that or any desire for it, because one of the things that people don't seem to realize, or maybe they're ignoring, is that we now have the issue of the desert tortoise who keeps popping up. And they keep claiming that the cattle are stomping on their feeding areas and they're stomping through their habitats and so forth. So, in effect, what's going on is that a animal that likely would have gone extinct if just left alone is now being placed in front of you and I. And so you can't have your steak and I can't have my hamburger, and somebody over here can't have their beef ribs because they're worried about a turtle in the middle of the desert that is more important than you and me.
And to be honest, it really, you look at after this interview, I'll actually be talking with Cliff Gardner, who has documented this since well beyond before the 80s, and using the BLM and these federal agencies' own research to demonstrate that his thoughts are that the turtle actually benefits from the biodiversity created by the running of cattle in that area and the water that has to be put into place for the running of cattle. So even that argument is one that is contested.
Yeah, it's one of those, matter of fact, when in the very beginning you asked how I met Cliven, and I met Cliven after the 2014 event. He was brought down by the former county chairman here to speak at some of the IAP events. I met him and I visited him up at his ranch, and it's funny how the narrative is being turned to make this guy into an evil lunatic when he is literally a very simple farmer and herder. I mean, the guy he's not a complicated character. He's easily likable. He's just stubborn as all hell, but he's not a bad guy. He speaks from the heart and he speaks from the truth. And he even made that statement. He said, "We put water out there, we fence it. We put fences up there. We put water out there. We provide access to things so that people can get in and out." I mean, they've done a considerable amount of improvements to the range to support their cattle on the range, and it makes you wonder whether or not this whole argument has ever been about cattle. It may, because they've been in, Cliven and the 17 others have been in jail for about a year now, right? The cattle is still on the range. If it was ever about the cows and not about who controls the property and who controls the land and who can use the land, those cows should have been gone relatively quickly.
And it really begs a question, why are there no more families of the 56 original families in the county that began fighting this with the Endangered Species Declaration of the desert tortoise in 1989? Why are there none left other than the Bundys, who will now effectively be put out of business and off the land? It sure seems like there is something else at play here, where you have a county that at one point, was able to support 50 plus cattle ranching families, and now there are none. And we know that ties into, the desert tortoise intimately, especially with the construction coming from Las Vegas, where they had to take and move tortoises. And as part of that agreement, the city of Las Vegas put money up to buy out a lot of these families so that they could be kind of moved off the land there in the county. So one has to wonder why that was put into place and what's kind of behind it.
I can only suggest, the only thing I can suggest in that regard is that politics is behind it, and it's a power play. It really boils down to a power play. I've got it, I'll say who uses it, and that's the end of it. And if it wasn't for the stubbornness and the thick-headedness that makes up most of Cliven and his boys, they probably would have been gone decades ago. But, there is there are legitimate claims, and there are legitimate historical factors involved that really, to use a term that describes real estate, clouds the title of Gold Butte. And until somebody actually pushes the buttons, whether it be through congressional action, through the actions of the elected officials in Congress from the state of Nevada, or it's through the court system, which, my recommendation, and this is strictly my recommendation, is that any challenge to this issue is not brought here in the Nevada court. As you may be aware, Cliven's prior attorney filed suit against literally the judge, the president, Harry Reid, who's now going to be a former senator, Harry Reid's son, and kind of mucked up the works for a legitimate argument about the territory, the land itself. I've made the suggestion several times, and I still stand by the suggestion, is that as a federal agency, as a part of federal government, we take the fight to their backyard. We bring it in the district court for Washington, D.C. We argue the matter in a court that's so far away from this that they can look at it at least more objectively, as opposed to within the emotional and political mix that has become the Gold Butte issue. And hopefully, one of these days, somebody will do something. I've put myself forward to lead the charge because there's a lot to be done. But as you had mentioned before, resources are thin. And because of those resources being thin, this is a fight that really needs to be made. Otherwise, we might as well just kiss our rights goodbye in terms of statehood. Because basically what we're saying is that the federal government can come in and say, you know what? Those 10,000 acres, those 100,000 acres, those 1.5 million acres that are over there that we say that belong to us or are controlled through BLM or controls with the Forestry Service or whatnot. You know what? You can't use them at all. Can you imagine what would happen with all the logging industry in the Northwest?
Well, that's happened largely here in the area I live in the state of Montana, where logging has just been cut off, and it's been just dire economic situation created.
Yeah, and it's for what? And really, what benefit has it? You put people out of work. I mean, they could turn around and they can literally wipe out the coal industry overnight by doing something like this. And it's a concern. It's a legitimate concern. It's an economic issue. It's there really. Let's put it this way. Can't speak for Utah because I'm not familiar with the area in Utah. But 1.35 acres. That's a lot of space that's been cut off from the use of the public. But 300,000 acres with just, and keep this in mind, with a pending criminal suit brought by the federal government that contains these issues. I think it was a really bad choice and a bad time for President Obama to have made that declaration. And don't get me wrong, the Antiquities Act gives him the right to do it for public lands owned or controlled by the federal government. But the underlying issue here is, do they own and do they control that land to be able to make this designation? And that's what brings us back to the problem that, Cliven and his supporters have been fighting. And for the most part, if you ask people out here in Clark County, a lot of people support him not because they support cattle ranching. They support the idea of limited federal government intervention in local events, local affairs. It's not that it's not that people disregard the rights of the federal government. It's just that, there's only so much the federal government is really supposed to do, and people are getting tired of them telling them what we have to do. If you understand where I'm going with this.
Sure.
So, I mean, that's pretty much where we are when it comes to this. It's an issue that may be brought up during a criminal trial. I don't know. I'm not involved in the preparation of anybody's defense, and if I was, I couldn't share it anyway. But it's certainly a legitimate issue that now has to be dealt with in one respect by Congress, because Congress is the only one who can actually overturn this. There's no formal, if you look at the law again, there's no way for the president to say after he does it, oops, I need a mulligan. I need a do-over. And it may take a lawsuit that says, you know what, as applied to this particular territory in Nevada, that action was unconstitutional and illegal and needs to be overturned. But unless somebody stands up and brings that to a court where we can argue the facts and show the history, it's not going to happen anytime soon.
All right, Warren. Well, is there anything you'd like to add in closing that you haven't touched on?
What I would like to say is that I just want people. I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I'm not a conspiracy nut. I'm not looking for. I don't look for people hiding in the bush and say, you know what, this, that, or the next thing is plausible or possible because of 100 unrelated issues. These are real issues that have been brought to light. But I can say this one simple fact, that the land itself has been a thorn in the side, especially from Nevada, to the federal government for a lot of years. We've heard of the Sagebrush Rebellion from up north. Now you've got the Bundy standoff from 2014. The stories themselves that are being told from the side that's actually speaking, that's actually allowed to be heard, is not exactly 100% true. And we need to take that with a grain of salt. And you need anybody who's interested in the events that have transpired has to be able to look at it with a very clear conscience and a very open mind to recognize that while it's happening in Nevada, which relatively we're small compared to the rest of the country. I mean, we only have about 2.5 million people in the state. And it really, things that occur here don't necessarily impact a lot of people, but you can see what's going on a lot clearer because of it. So if you're looking to get involved, if you're interested in finding out what's going on, uh, do so by doing your homework, and do it with a clear conscience and a clear head and an ability to say, okay, I can weigh these factors, because the truth, it really is somewhere in the middle from what everybody's telling us. So I'll leave you with that.
All right, Warren. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us and fill us in on some of these details. We appreciate it.
I appreciate your time, Jason, and good luck with the rest.
All right.